I was looking for photos for Kimberly's episode on the Hinterkaifeck axe murders when I stumbled across an incredible theory about the case. What stunned me was how well the theory tied together many bizarre and unexplained aspects of this case. But yet, despite these strengths, I believe the theory must be wrong because it makes one necessary and gigantic leap that I can't accept as likely or even possible. If you like to theorize about unsolved cases, I really hope you can stick around for this episode because there's an enormous lesson to be learned. If you know the case and haven't heard this theory before, you'll want to hear this. It's very detailed and explains much of the weird evidence, and for that reason is very convincing. And yet I can't buy it. Let's see what you think. And let's see what lessons we take from it that we can remember for other cases. Hopefully you've checked out Kimberly's first presentation on the channel. She's a very smart and talented young woman who researched, wrote, and narrated the episode. She's also studied in Germany and is familiar with the region in which the crime took place. Please show her a little support because she has a very bright future. While researching for photos to add to this narration, I found details that were new to me. For example, weird but true, the bodies of the family lie headless in their graves. Don't worry, I won't leave you hanging, I'll get to that later. But let's get right to this impressive theory. I'm not going to tease you about who the killer is. According to the theory, it's none other than Andreas Gruber himself, the head of the family. The family was killed on March 31st, 1922 in Hinterkaifeck, Germany. What should grab your attention immediately about this theory, if you're familiar with the case, is that Andreas was also killed. So how could he be the killer? His body was found in the barn right alongside his wife, daughter, and granddaughter. So as I was reading about this theory, I kept wondering, how in the hell are they going to explain how Andreas killed his family but ended up dead right alongside them? If you aren't familiar with the wounds found on Andreas, you might suggest suicide, but his death was no suicide. So how do they account for it? As I read the theory, I was beyond skeptical because I knew Andreas died from a horrific wound to his face. But I was surprised at how convincing the theory was. I actually learned several details about the crime scene that I hadn't seen in the other literature. So let's run down the theory. As Kimberly explains in more detail, police believe the Grubers were lured into the barn one by one and then killed with a kind of pickaxe called a mattock. Inside the home, the 2-year-old grandson of Andreas was killed in his crib, and the middle-aged maid, who had just arrived that day to begin the job, was killed in her bedroom. There are signs that young Kazelia, only 7, did not die right away because tufts of her own hair were found in her hands. An odd aspect of this case is that the killer apparently lived in the farmhouse for a few days after the murders, cooked his meals. He fed the farm animals, milked the cows. When he moved on, he left the doors locked, and he didn't touch any of the large sums of money lying around. This was a farm village, so the murders were not discovered for several days. Back then, the importance of securing a crime scene was less known. By the time professional police had arrived, neighbors had gone through the crime scene, certainly disrupting the evidence. Among the first at the crime scene was a neighbor called Lorenz Schlittenbauer. That would make a great beer name. For various reasons, he became the main suspect of the villagers, but there are other reasons he's crucial to the story. 1914 was the pivotal year when World War I began, then known as the Great War. It was also in this year that Andreas's daughter Victoria became pregnant with Kazelia, the little girl murdered in the barn 7 years later. The accusation was made that the true father of the girl was actually Andreas himself. In fact, he and Victoria were hauled into court in 1915, tried and convicted of incest. She was sentenced to a month in prison, Andreas a year. Meanwhile, the man they claimed was the father, Carl Gabriel, had gone off to war and died during the first year. The rumor among the villagers was that Andreas had only sent Victoria out to find a man to bed because she was already pregnant by Andreas. In 1920, the pattern repeated. This time, she bedded their next-door neighbor, Schlittenbauer. The result of this bedding was the birth of Joseph, who 2 years later would die in his crib, unless, of course, Andreas was the real father of Joseph. The whole thing is odd because it was Schlittenbauer who initiated the incest complaint 5 years before that led to the convictions. So let's get to the evidence and the theory. Warning, it's a horrific tale. But then you wouldn't be here if you couldn't handle that. I'll leave a link to the book that presents this theory. It centers around the killing weapon. Here it is. It's called a mattock. Pay particular attention to the long screws. According to these researchers, this weapon was used to kill hogs. It was the 30mm long screw that struck the fatal blow to the animals. The length of the screw was adjustable in case a longer screw was needed. The idea was to kill the animal with as little damage as possible, which greatly affected the quality of the meat. This killing method involved a precise blow that took much practice to perfect. The contention is that this type of blow was used to kill Andreas's wife and daughter. Multiple blows, actually. His wife had 8 puncture wounds shaped like this. His daughter had 9. 7-year-old Kazilia did not suffer any blows from an instrument like that because, according to the theory, Andreas wanted her alive for a time so he could rape her. According to this research, it was very well known locally that Andreas treated his family extremely brutally. He was known to threaten or attack neighbors as well. The researchers claimed neighbors wanted to report him for child abuse, but refrained from doing so because they were concerned it would only cause more suffering to the children. He's said to have beaten his children and kept them malnourished. He locked his children in the cold cellar for many days during the winter. Sophie, one of his daughters, supposedly died as a result of this abuse. His daughter Victoria told Schlittenbauer that her father would beat her to death if she slept around, the one exception being when she was pregnant from him and they needed to portray someone else as the father. Victoria had strangulation marks on her neck, which the researchers suggest indicates an emotional bond with the killer. Kazilia was found half naked in the barn besides her mother and grandmother. Unlike the others, she had not been struck with the mattock, but she was struck with a different object in the mouth, a vicious blow that would have silenced her, crushing her face, but apparently not killing her. So at some point, her throat was cut. Authorities believe she lived for hours, pulling out tufts of hair. These researchers imagined her death like this. Andreas, having killed his wife and daughter, began raping her. With her mother and grandmother lying dead beside her, the girl screamed, so he struck her to silence her. At some point, he finished her off with a small knife. Now, this theory explains a lot of weird aspects of the case. The Gruber's dog was unharmed. The murder weapon was hidden in a compartment above the kitchen that opened with a false door, something only a resident might know about. It was only found a year later when the property was destroyed. The animals were cared for in the days after the murders. They had a tear-off calendar, the kind where you rip off a piece every day to show the new date. Well, the murders took place on the 31st, but the tears marked to April 1st. Maybe an intruder would do this, but it's more likely a resident would. But they were all dead, unless Andreas was still alive. The killer didn't sleep in the Gruber's bed. He slept in the hayloft in the barn. He removed roof tiles, presumably so he could keep a lookout for the police. And they theorized that's why he slept there. He wasn't planning to run for it, he had nowhere to go, and he expected the police to come at any time. He even defecated up there so he wouldn't have to leave this lookout spot. Remains of smoked meat were found in the lookout spot, so he ate there too. He also attached ropes to various beams so he could quickly lower himself to the ground. I'm not sure I understand the purpose of this. I think the researchers are suggesting he could descend quickly and quietly this way. It seems a little nutty to me. I mean, I guess the same contraption could be used by an intruder in order to sneak up on the family when he lured him into the barn. There was a lot of gold and silver money, which was never stolen. Okay, so far the theory does succeed in explaining some things, such as why the animals were cared for, why the dog didn't attack the killer, why the screw on the mattock was used to kill 2 of the victims. If the local rumors about Andreas were accurate, it does paint a consistent picture. He would be a kind of psychopath who views his family members as possessions. He'd have no emotional attachment to them beyond that. The one emotion that is sharp within a psychopath is anger. So it makes sense that Victoria was killed in a jealous rage. But now we get to the big problem with this theory. Andreas was found dead in the barn right next to his wife, daughter, and granddaughter. His wound is described as a sharp blow to the face by an instrument, presumably the mattock, which ripped the skin from his face, exposing his cheekbone and severing the carotid artery. The theory by these researchers is that he fell on his pickaxe, and that's where the wheels come right off. The odds against anyone falling on their pickaxe and suffering a wound that results in quick death must be astronomical. And to do this right next to the bodies of the other victims makes those odds even more preposterous. The reason I find this theory so fascinating is because it does succeed in tying up so many loose ends, solves so many mysteries in the case, and yet it's utterly absurd. As I was reading the theory, I was thinking maybe Schlittenbauer came upon Andreas after Andreas had just killed the others, and the neighbor committed swift justice by killing him. But that's even more absurd. For one thing, any theory that requires us to concoct something that complicated should be suspect. But also, Schlittenbauer lived next door with his sons, yet the killer stayed in the Gruber house for days. So I really think there's a lesson here for us with this theory, something to keep in mind with other cases. Sometimes a theory can really seem to tie up a lot of loose ends. It can be very convincing for this reason, yet it's wrong because of one key element that doesn't work. Consider the Lizzie Borden case. In so many ways, it only makes sense if Lizzie is the killer. Yet she never left the property. The police were there about 10 or 15 minutes after the murder of her father. The murder weapon was never found. Police searched the house multiple times over several days, rigorous, determined searches. They tore out carpets, pulled bricks from chimneys, emptied the septic pit, and dragged a nearby little pond. Nothing. Now, that doesn't mean Lizzie didn't do the murders, but there's a foundational fact that you can't just shrug off. If you can't explain where the weapon went, you can't point with any confidence at Lizzie Borden. It requires one to consider either some more convoluted theory, such as someone helping her get rid of the weapon, or something very unlikely, such as Lizzie hiding it in the little house where police just couldn't find it. And then there's the Delphi murders. While it might not be completely certain that police have all of Libby's communications from the hours and days before, it's highly likely they do. The interrogation transcript suggests they do. Libby's sister Kelsey seems to think they do. Now, it's possible we'll learn that Libby's phone could be tracked through some social media app that she had on it, so maybe a predator connected to her through the app and tracked her to the bridge. But by far, the most likely explanation at this point is that no one knew Libby and Abby were going to the bridge that day, which means Keegan Kline, who does have a compelling and circumstantial case around him, wouldn't be involved. The Hinterkaifeck case shows the danger of a really good theory. It can sway us, but we have to be careful. No matter how compelling the theory is, if it rests on a foundational leg which is absurd or highly unlikely, the theory is on very shaky ground. Before I let you go, I promise to explain why the corpses of the family are buried without their heads. Apparently, the skulls were removed during the autopsy and sent to Munich to be examined for, and I quote, metaphysical clues. I have no idea what that means. We know that 1922 is not far removed from a time when some believed that the image of the last thing you saw before dying was still inside your eyes and could somehow be ascertained by investigators. Maybe these metaphysical procedures were even more bizarre. Maybe they tried to make the victims speak. Now there's an idea for a creepypasta. Speaking of which, if you're in the mood for a good fictional story, check out our new Creepy Fridays series. Now, I'd like you to attempt a metaphysical procedure of your own by clicking subscribe and maybe even notify. Your support is what keeps us going. Thanks.